Egypt, where they're not eating manna, where they're able to have the grain of the new land. And in fact, it's the day after the Passover meal, where they were able to have the grain of the new land, the manna stops. They're no longer eating it. They're relying on the produce of the promised land to feed them. It's been handed over. Yeah.
Welcome to TBC Extra, a weekly podcast of our Sunday sermon and a little extra. I am Teresa Jenkins, the communications director here at Topeka Bible Church.
And I'm Jason Brent, the children's pastor at Topeka Bible Church. And we're glad you're here. And now for a little extra.
Hello, welcome to the podcast studio. Look who's here.
It is me.
It's Spencer.
I'm here.
Our student. No, he's not a student intern anymore.
No.
Not this time.
I've grown out of that. I can't go back anytime soon,
well,
sadly.
You could if you really tried. But...
I mean, you know what? I will quit my job so I can go back.
Oh, no. We want you to stay in your position. And that's why you're here today.
Yes.
Because you are new to our staff. You are one of my staff brothers, so to speak, and tell us more about that. We're glad to have you here.
Yeah. So I've been working 2 weeks now. I'm the new college director for the up and coming college age ministry, I should say, here at TBC. And so it's been in the planning for a little bit now. I accepted the job back in November, and then they told me I couldn't really tell anyone at TBC until they announced it in church. I'm like, that makes sense.
And you're
then
like, oh.
It was a lot of waiting.
Can't wait.
It was a lot of waiting. But now it's finally here. I'm finally back and just hitting the ground running, and it's been very encouraging, very fun, very excited to see kind of what God's doing. So the ministry hasn't actually started yet. Right now I'm in the planning phase and meeting up with students and potential volunteers and stuff like that. So
So for those who don't know you, who either didn't see you teach, you've taught twice now in what the kids call big church. Or if you don't have a student that's been in student ministry the last couple of years, tell us who you are, where you hail from, and a little bit about your background.
Yeah, totally. So I guess I'll just start at the beginning. Grew up in Washington State, so nowhere near here, and stayed there for 18 years. I was homeschooled all the way up from preschool to college, into high school, college. I did a weird thing back in high school, but I did homeschooling. I was raised in the church, was raised in a Christian family, went to the same church my entire life, and just kind of grew up there. And that's where God formed me and gave me the desires and skill sets that I have now that have kind of led me in this direction going into ministry. And so, I spent, like I said, my first 18 years of life there. That's kind of all I knew in Washington. And I always tell people Washington's beautiful, but I did not know that growing up because that's all I knew.
Did you think the whole world might have looked like that for a little while?
Yeah, I'm like, it's just, I see trees, I see mountains. It's cool, I guess. But then when I went to college, over at Moody Bible Institute. Started going to college there when I was 18. I noticed everything was just flat. And I'm like, well, where's the trees? I just see cement buildings.
For those who don't know, Moody Bible is at?
It's in Chicago. So I spent 4 years there in Chicago, and it's like smack dab in the middle of Chicago downtown. You can walk to the Magnificent Mile. Yep. You can go to the Lake Michigan, just walk there. Everything's in walking distance. It's crazy. And so, I spent 4 years there. I got my biblical preaching degree because I knew God was calling me specifically into preaching. I didn't know what that would look like, but beforehand, I'm like, okay. Or God told me, he's like, hey, I want you to go in this direction through lots of different things he's done. And so I pursued a preaching degree there, and just kind of hunkered down in Chicago and just really just wanted to hone the craft of preaching and get good at it and understand here's how to study the Bible and here's how to craft a faithful sermon to the text and all of that. And that's one of my biggest passions. I love preaching. And that's one of the reasons why I was able to preach a couple times in big kids service.
Yes, and we're glad that you will. I believe we'll be seeing you on Sundays. Is what I'm trying to say. We'll be seeing you some Sundays, but really, for now, you are trying to build a brand new ministry. We've had young adults ministry that span anywhere from right out of high school up to age 35. You're going to help us kind of hone in and zero in on an underserved population in our community. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so that is kind of one of my biggest, passions for this job, is because even though I am fresh out of college, just graduated in December, my biggest heart is for those college age students, because I know what it's like. And I know the things that have helped me through and the things that have kind of dug me into that hole. So we are narrowing in onto the college age, the college age range, because it's such a transition time from high school. You're more independent, and it's like, okay, how do we learn to engage in a Christ-like community? What does that look like now that I'm on my own? And so that's my heart for this ministry, and just to serve the college students, as well as this position will be very much involved at Washburn. Good. So the Washburn campus, I'll be there a lot. And right now we're working through the details of what that side of the ministry is going to exactly look like. But in the hopefully near future, there will be an established ministry there where TBC can be serving the community of Washburn, that we can be building something up there and just advancing God's kingdom there on campus. So I'm super excited about that. I'm super excited about the ministry that'll be here at the church and combining them too. There's just so many cool things that God's been doing and that God can do. So I'm just sitting back and watching him work.
That's awesome. We're really pumped because we have students who come from children's ministry, even the nursery, clear up through high school, and not all of them go away to college. Some of them stay here and maybe even go to technical college, or stay here and go to Washburn, and so, or do online classes. And so to be able to meet that community while they're still here and welcome people coming from outside to Washburn campus, that's just great. Well, Spencer, I know we'll have you back on the podcast, especially on your teaching days, and for other purposes, hopefully so too. So stay tuned. You'll be hearing more about when this ministry is going to launch. It's going to be, can you give us like a little kind of a teaser?
It is coming up here in a couple weeks. I don't know when exactly this is posting, but I'm guessing by the time this is posted, maybe 2 to 3 weeks from then.
That sounds about right.
It'll be up and running. So.
Excellent. So mid to late February 2025 is when you'll see that at Topeka Bible Church. Stay tuned. Yeah. Meanwhile, let's jump into this week's Joshua sermon.
When I don't know how many of you loved geography when you were in school. You know, probably was your favorite subject. But if you were to be asked, what's the most important river in the world, you might say the Nile, maybe the Mississippi or the Amazon. But in the Bible, the answer is very clearly the Jordan River. The Jordan River sort of sets, particularly where we're at right now in the book of Joshua, sets the eastern edge of the promised land. And it's this mighty, beautiful river. And for the nation of Israel, they have been waiting to cross this river for a very, very long time. Depending on how you want to do your math, the current people who are about to cross it have been waiting over 40 years to do that. They've sort of seen it as this symbolic gateway into the gift that God had given to them. But if you want to track all the way back to the promise to Abraham, when God told him in Genesis 12, hey, to your descendants I'm going to give this land that you are sitting on, and Israel has now come back around to retake and live in the land of promise, it's about 600 years. Whichever way you cut it, the nation of Israel has been waiting to cross the Jordan River. And this morning, we're going to talk about that in Joshua chapters 3 and 4. It's one of the most important events in the whole Bible. You might not think of it that way, but for what it represents for this group of people, for God's chosen, how it kind of establishes a new timeline. Really, it's a watershed moment. It's one of those events in history where things come before it and things come after, but it's a reference point. When did Israel cross over the Jordan River into the land of promise? But what's most interesting to us this morning, or really I should say what we can take away, is not so much the miraculous crossing of the Jordan, which we'll get to for sure, but it's really what God told Israel to do before the crossing and after the crossing. There was something they were supposed to do to prepare for this miracle, and then after God delivered them over into the land, something they were supposed to do to remember it. And though crossing the Jordan River needs to be seen in its context as showing Israel that they have a living God who is powerful, who will defeat their enemies, often today there are many places where we could say we're crossing a Jordan River of our own, and it's good to remember what they were supposed to do before and after. So let's go ahead and look at Joshua 3. That's where we'll get started. Joshua chapters 3 and 4 cover the same event, but sort of on different sides of the river. You might remember last week, or rather 2 weeks ago, last time we had our series here in Joshua, they had spoken with the prostitute Rahab, and she had given them information. They had scouted out the land, and then they went back and told Joshua, hey, the Lord has prepared it for us. He has given it to us as a gift. Remember, that was Rahab's own words as well. She had said that too. The Lord has given this to you. And so as the spies come back, it's go time, right? God has given them the land. It's time to cross. So Joshua started early the next morning and left the acacia grove with all the Israelites. They went as far as the Jordan and stayed there before the crossing. After 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, when you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God carried by the Levitical priests, you are to break camp and follow it. But keep a distance of about 1,000 yards between yourselves and the ark. A very important sentence. Don't go near it so that you can see the way to go, for you haven't traveled this way before. Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, get ready, because the Lord will do wonders among you tomorrow. Then he said to the priests, carry the Ark of the Covenant and go on ahead of the people. So they carried the Ark of the Covenant and went ahead of them. For those who don't know, right, the Ark of the Covenant is this sort of gilded box that contains the Ten Commandments. It contains a jar of manna. It contains the budded staff from Aaron. But really, it is where it is the artifact that, well, melts the face off of Nazis, if you read Indiana Jones. But besides that, it sits deep in the tabernacle in the Holy of Holies. Later on, it will be in the deepest part of the temple. And though God does not live in it, don't think that, it is a representation of his physical presence. And so that is why, for instance, if you touch it and you're not supposed to, you'll die, because the sinful hands of man cannot touch a holy God without his cleansing power. And so the Ark of the Covenant really represents God's physical presence in the camp. And so the priests are supposed to, because there were a few who could, pick it up, and they're going to lead the whole nation. The nation is going to follow behind the Ark of the Covenant, and these priests are supposed to take it to the river. And what is significant about that event, and God telling them to do this, is that all the way through the desert, the Ark was leading the way. Right? God was always leading his people into the next thing, the next chapter, through the wilderness when they did not know where to go or how to go that far. God was the one who was leading them. And the same thing happens here. He says, so that you can see the way to go, for you haven't traveled this way before. The point was not like, can you see the other side of the river? It's God is leading them into the land of promise. And furthermore, they don't know how they're going to cross the rivers. We'll find out later. It's the flood season, and so it's overflowed its banks, and it is difficult for a few spies to cross, let alone tens of thousands of people, their families, and their livestock. Not a thing that they have an answer to right away here. We're not building bridges across the Jordan for all these folks. And so God simply says, you need to expect great things to happen. I've already told you, we know they're about to cross the Jordan River. They don't know how. They have just been told from the Lord, follow the ark and expect great things, right? And so as the priests pick up the ark and the nation follows behind them at an appropriate distance, right, so they don't endanger their lives, they get to the edge of the river. Then Joshua told the Israelites, come closer and listen to the words of the Lord your God. He said, you will know that the living God is among you and that he will certainly dispossess before you the Canaanites, Hethites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. Basically, all the bad dudes in the land. When the ark of the covenant of the Lord of the whole earth goes ahead of you into the Jordan. Now choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, 1 man for each tribe. When the feet of the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of the whole earth, come to rest in the Jordan's water, its water will be cut off. The water flowing downstream will stand up in a mass. Throughout history, Israel's crossing of the Jordan River has given rise to many interpretations. It's very easy to make a symbolic or allegorical message out of this, right? It's a sign of baptism, it's a sign of faith, it's perseverance, it's endurance, it's all of these different things. But in context, which is always our first look here, right? What does Joshua say the purpose is? He says, well, you will know that you have a living God that is among you, and that he will certainly dispossess before you these nations. You have a God who is living and not dead. That contrasts with all the other fake gods and idols they're about to encounter. He is among you. He is not far off and distant. He is not a God who is just sort of living on the fringes of your life, but he is here, present, and in fact, he is leading the charge. And then third, you will see him remove the mighty nations that are in front of you immediately following this. Next week, we'll talk about the fight against the first major city of Jericho, right? And they need to know that they have a living God who is among them that is going to kick them out. And so for a lot of folks who were living during this time, or I should say for everybody, basically except for Joshua and Caleb, they were either little children or unborn. Well, the last time such a magnificent event occurred, being the crossing of the Red Sea. God did miracles throughout the 40 years of wandering, but the crossing of the Jordan River not only forms a bookend, parting waters to go over on dry land at the beginning and the end of a wandering journey, but on top of that, it was a sign for the next generation. The previous generation crossed the Red Sea. The previous generation got to see the 10 plagues in Egypt. If the folks who are here right now did get to see it, they were at least younger than 20 years old, and most of them hadn't been born. And so this is a sign for the next generation. And basically Joshua is saying, do you want to see God? Watch what happens next. When the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant ahead of the people. Now the Jordan overflows its banks throughout the harvest season, but as soon as the priests carrying the ark reached the Jordan, their feet touched the water at its edge, and the water flowing downstream stood still, rising up in a mass that extended as far as Adam, a city next to Zarethan. The water flowing downstream into the Sea of the Arabah, the Dead Sea, was completely cut off, and the people crossed opposite Jericho. The priests carrying the Ark of the Lord's covenant stood firmly on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground until the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan. So there's a lot of language in this passage, which is basically one long sentence in Hebrew, and in a way that we don't really appreciate because it's in English. The author here is doing a really good job of building suspense. And essentially, he's just sort of listing out the events as they happened, so that it builds to this kind of climax when the nation of Israel finally crosses over. And as that's happening, and as we're reading this story, there are other elements that mirror the way that the crossing of the Red Sea was described. For instance, the fact that the Red Sea, the waters, when Moses parted the Red Sea, and the waters stood up. It's a very specific word. The same word is used here for the waters of the Jordan. They stood up. Same thing, that they were passing through on dry ground is the same thing that is said about the crossing of the Red Sea when they were fleeing from Egypt. It is not that they were like, put on their waders and just were trying to trudge through a little bit. It's like the ground was dry. God had backed up all of this water. And then it even gives sort of a reference point about how far it went. See, we know approximately where Adam is, because we know where Zarethan is, and we know approximately where they crossed the Jericho. And so using the kind of geography of the land, see, the Jordan Valley is very wide and very deep, right? The Dead Sea is the lowest point on earth, or the lowest body of water on earth. And so the Jordan River Valley is very deep, but it's also very wide. And so if you're thinking about the flood season and all of these different things, look, I didn't do the math. I just wanted to show you this picture, okay? The point is that this is not, even if you just think about the Jordan, maybe you've been over to Israel and had the privilege of wading in the Jordan, and you're like, okay, it's not the most gigantic river of them all. It's not the Mississippi or something. Yes, but it was flood season. And in order to have tens of thousands of people passing through and their animals and their families safely over an entire day, think about the volume of water that is getting stopped up here, such that those who are walking through, and in fact, we see in the text that the priests who led the way with the Ark of the Covenant end up stopping in the middle of the river, so that as the nation of Israel passes by, they are seeing the Ark of the Covenant holding back the waters. So the priests don't go across the other side until all of Israel has passed through. Now, the crossing of the Jordan, I've said it a couple times, it is one of the most important events in the nation of Israel's history, and in fact, because of that, the Bible. So why though? Why is this so important? Because it's a miraculous event that the waters were parted, stood up, and they got to cross over. But there are a couple reasons why this runs a bit deeper. No pun intended. It fulfills God's great promise to Abraham. There's the rest of Joshua and even part of Judges is going to be kicking out the inhabitants of the land, and the success and failure to do so. But the idea that this is sort of the moment that is representative of God telling Abraham, I will give this land to your descendants. And now Israel has crossed over. Up and until this point, after really, Joseph and his family, Jacob, they had gone down to Egypt. No Israelites have gone back into the promised land except for the spies. And not even all the spies reported back properly. So this moment right here, when they now set foot on the other side, it fulfills God's great promise to Abraham, which will continue to be exercised from Genesis 12. Number two, it reminds Israel of God's strength. We already talked about that, but there is this sort of active desire that the Lord has, that the generation after generation would understand who He is, what He has done, and then would be able to tell the next generation. That's going to become a huge point here in a moment from Joshua chapter 4. But the purpose why God does this is He says, I want you to know that I am a living God who is among you that will drive out these nations. Like some of you have forgotten those things. Some of you have become used to, it's just like, manna from heaven again this morning, right? Again, God has delivered water from a rock or whatever it is. And he's like, so I'm going to do a big thing. I'm going to do a really big thing that reminds you that as you go up against these mighty nations that I can handle them, believe me. And third and finally, it establishes a new era in Israel's history. This is one of those events that there's a before and an after. I've said already that it's like a bookend to their wandering. They cross a body of water at the beginning of this journey, and they cross a body of water heading into the promised land. From this point on, everything will be about driving out the inhabitants and fulfilling, because some of it definitely is their responsibility. Their obedience helps make sure that God's promise is fulfilled the way that he has desired. In other words, he has given them the power to do it. Will they exercise it? But also that they will be able to maintain the land and have it be at rest. This becomes one of the continuing themes of the Promised Land. And ultimately, if you're familiar with the Bible, why later on the exile is such a big deal is it's because, the enemies have returned. We cannot maintain the land. We're no longer at rest from war. We've been disobedient to God. But there's history before and after the Jordan River that is separated. Now, all of the commands, you go back to Leviticus, God had given them all these, rules and regulations, and you read them and you recognize there's a lot of those rules they can't fulfill properly until they're in the promised land. God had been preparing them for this moment for a long, long time. So to this point, though, that it was not just about this moment of crossing, but that they were supposed to expect great things beforehand. And then, as God is about to tell them, there is a key activity they're supposed to do now that they have crossed over to the other side. Joshua chapter 4. After the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord spoke to Joshua. Choose 12 men from the people, 1 man for each tribe, and command them. Take 12 stones from this place in the middle of the Jordan where the priests are standing. Carry them with you and set them down at the place where you spend the night. So Joshua summoned the 12 men he had selected from the Israelites. Remember, he had done that before they crossed. 1 man for each tribe. And said to them, go across to the ark of the Lord your God in the middle of the Jordan. Each of you lift a stone onto his shoulder, 1 for each of the Israelite tribes, so that this will be a sign among you. Picture for a moment. You're one of the 12, right? Why from each tribe? Because it's representative of the whole. What they're about to do is for the entire people. It's not just for these 12 and their families. They take the heads of the tribes, and they are to go, they've crossed over, everybody has. The only thing that's left in the Jordan are the priests, the Ark of the Covenant, and a gigantic wall of water, okay? And they're supposed to go back in and go around the priests and grab stones from nearby their feet, sort of this location that represents what God has done. And they carry them back, and they're supposed to set up a memorial or a sign. And a sign to what? And why are we doing this sort of thing? What are a bunch of rocks supposed to do here? Well, the point is that anytime Israel would go by this location, anytime that they would see these stones, and in particular, anytime their children would ask about what happened to them, they could reference this point as a reminder, as a sign, as a memorial of what God has done and all of his power. It might seem a little odd to have these 12 stones there, but if you can kind of take a step removed from how it's built, we do this all the time. If you drive in Kansas City at all, you're familiar with this, which is the memorial to those who fell in World War I. And if you go, and you should, you see there the stories of bravery and courage expressed by the Americans and Allied forces in the Great War. None of us were alive when World War I happened, right? Yet this stands as a testament to what they had done, what they did, And as you go back and as you see them, it draws into your mind things that we should be thankful for and things that we should respect and honor and pay deference towards. And it just keeps things going in a different way than somebody saying, well, you know, my grandpa or my great-grandfather fought in that war. It draws us into a place of particular remembrance. And so this is what those 12 stones were supposed to do. But then you also have to think about who were they for? Because they're not for the people who just crossed through. They have their memories to give them a reminder at all times. I doubt for the rest of their life you would ever forget walking across the dry Jordan River with water 100 foot high on your right side. I don't think you forget that thing. But their children might, or those who are not born yet might. It ends up that this becomes one of the problems with the next generation. Joshua set up in Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken from the Jordan, and he said to the Israelites, in the future, when your children ask their fathers, what is the meaning of these stones? Dad, why do we have stones lying here? You should tell your children, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground, for the Lord your God dried up the water of the Jordan before you until you had crossed over, just as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed over. This is so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord's hand is strong, and so that you may always fear the Lord your God. The generation who is crossing the Jordan River, in Joshua 3 and 4, were either children or unborn when their parents crossed the Red Sea. Well, that was their parents' memorial to God's power and strength and fear, as we find out. It's actually after the Red Sea crossing. You can go back and look in Exodus. It is after that moment that they placed their trust in God and in his leader, Moses. The Red Sea is this amazing event that sort of unified the nation following after the Lord. Well, now the crossing of the Jordan River is going to be that for the next generation. And the question becomes, what will it be for the generation after? Because we have this very terrible habit of forgetting God's power and his might and the fact that he is worthy of our respect and that he can do these kinds of things. And even, you could say, just as important, is maintaining the promised land, making sure that you are able to persist, live in the land that God has made for you and brought you back to. This is what the children are inheriting, right? Those who are crossing right now that are in their diapers, they are walking into a land that is going to be filled with abundance. The land of milk and honey. And they are not going to have the memory of walking through the desert. They are not going to have the memory of manna. They are not going to have the memory of all the struggles that their parents and their grandparents went through. They're just going to walk into a beautiful land. And so the danger then becomes, will they be able to maintain it, which is connected directly to their faith and obedience? And with that, will they be at rest from their enemies? Well, are they successful in that? But that's not our focus right now. Our focus is on the current generation. God says, you need to tell them of what I have done. You need to make sure that they know. Israel will always know the strength of God and have respect and fear for his mighty hand. Later on, when there is downfall and there is exile and there is no longer rest from the land, what has happened? That generation has often begun to worship other gods, or they do, not often, they are. And they have forgotten that the Lord's hand is strong, and they have forgotten what it means to respect and fear God. These 12 stones are a sign of God's love for them so that they may be able to keep the gift that he has just given to them. Now, you take the crossing of the Jordan River and you say, okay, well, the Kansas River, some people can ford that just on their own. You know, you can get a good kayak and just cross to the other side, right? What is the real impact for us? It's important to keep in mind that the context of this passage is not immediately to draw it into what's the Jordan River in your life, right? The immediate context is Joshua says, you have a living God who is powerful and is going to drive out your enemies. But nevertheless, we can still take these principles because there are many, many moments in our lives where we are heading towards a situation and we do not know how God is going to solve it or how we are going to cross it. It seems like an impenetrable barrier, right? Something that we can't get through on our own, and we go before the Lord and we ask Him for His help. Lord, will you divide the waters? Will you help us cross through on dry land? Will you give us the answer to this prayer? God, it seems like your promise is on the other side. What you have said is coming, and yet I don't see how we can get there. And in that moment, what we learn from Joshua 3 and 4 is not so much that God is faithful to maintain His promises. We know that. And that is told to us in many other stories. But really what is interesting here is what he tells the people to do before and after. The first part is there to expect great things. I don't want to overlook this point because it's so interesting that the nation of Israel has been told, hey, we're crossing over. But really the only thing that they are specifically given is they just say, the priests, you need to follow them and they're going to walk towards the river. Even the priests who are picking up the Ark of the Covenant, they're just told, just start walking. And it's, notice in the text, as soon as their feet touch the water, then the waters part. It is not the waters part, and then they walk through. It is they literally take a step of faith into the overflowing Jordan River, and then the waters stand up and part. It seems to be, in the Bible, that God's preferred way of working in the world and with His people, when the miraculous comes, when the answers to prayer come, are that we have taken a step of faith first, and then He answers. There are definitely examples in the Bible, plenty of them, and even in your own life, where God has told somebody to do something, and they go, show me a sign first. Occasionally He responds in grace and does that. Maybe in your own life, you've had one of those moments where you say, take this addiction from me, heal me, deliver me from this situation, and then I will follow after you. And God in His grace answers that plea. But far more often, what God desires is that people take that step of faith and then He does the thing that He was planning to do all along. Oftentimes we place conditions on God. We say, I'm not going to do this until you move first. I'm not going to change until you change first, until you alter my situation. And then I'll know that you're really the God that you say that you are. Imagine for a moment you invite a good friend out to lunch, okay? And you're going to meet with that friend at noon or whatever, and your friend gets to the restaurant and is waiting 15 minutes, texts you, you okay? Yeah, I was just making sure you got to the restaurant first. Now I'm leaving my house, right? Not too many lunch dates in your future with that friend. There's an aspect of faith that is shown, and even just assuming that your friend is going to appear at your designated time for lunch. And yet, so often, we treat God as if He must be the first mover in every single respect. Show up first, and then I'll leave my house, and I'll meet you there. But that's often not the way that God works. You can look at other examples in the Bible. One other clear one would be when Peter needs to step out of the boat onto the water in the stormy sea with Jesus, right? Before Peter does it, Jesus just says, hey, Peter, come to me. He doesn't say, I promise that when you step out of the boat, it's going to feel like you're on firm ground. Everything's going to be okay. He just says, Peter, come on, let's go. And then Peter steps. Turns out everything's just fine. And it's later on when he lacks faith, O ye of little faith, Peter, that he begins to sink. And so the first part here is that we need to expect great things. I don't think it is very fair for us to anticipate that God would do many great works when we do not have the faith to expect that they are coming. To think that He is going to move in all circumstances and situations and answer every single prayer, and yet we are reluctant to think that He will even do it in the first place. That's a hard position to be in. And so what Israel is told is that they must expect great things. Number 2, and once they had crossed over, is they are to remember his works. And this is where I want to just dig down for one moment, because I think this is where there's a lot of practical application. What does it look like in your life to basically pick up 12 big stones and put them on the other side of the river? Keep in mind what the purpose is here. The purpose is not so much that you remember, though surely that's part of it. It's that those who come after you will have a legacy of that faith. And when they ask questions, that you will be able to say, this is what God has done. That the stones, in fact, will be a reminder and will draw them into this place. What does it look like to remember his works? Well, here are a couple suggestions. Give your testimony. One of the most powerful things that you can do, especially if you are mature in your faith in Christ and you have walked with him for a long period of time, you've gone through the highs and the lows, right? Is to be able to tell the next generation and those around you what the Lord has done in your life. It is the sort of verbal act of placing 12 stones, is telling people about what God has done. You could literally place physical reminders. You could pick up 12 big stones if you wanted to, but this could be a plaque, this could be a picture, it could be a piece of artwork, it could be something that you picked up on a significant journey. In my office when I went to Israel, I have a couple stones that I picked up there and are on my bookshelf right now. But you can literally place physical reminders that when other people see them will make them ask a question. You can practice family rituals. Hannah and I, we're in the process of figuring this out with our kids right now. What will be the rhythms that our family hits that consistently drive our children towards this idea of their God? Is it around the dinner table? Is it before bedtime? Is it in the car taking kids to practice? How can you regularly talk about God with your family and especially with your kids? If you want to make it even bigger, you can plan an annual event. There are a lot of families who go to family camp during the summer with the church, and for them it's sort of this great time to just come together and celebrate faith as a family. You can celebrate spiritual milestones. If you have ever had the privilege of leading somebody to life in Christ, to a saving faith, if God has used you in that way, or you just know of somebody who has trusted in the Lord, you can celebrate that date. You can celebrate it as an annual reminder of the decision they made. Somebody gets baptized. It's why we love, I know it's somewhat unusual that as a church we just kind of do one big annual baptism for everybody who wants to get baptized. But part of the reason why we do that is so that it is this continual reminder, and those who've been baptized can come and celebrate the next generation who are doing it. And it is just this annual activity for our church of celebrating God's good works. You can make the moments that mattered memorable. And then finally, though it's not exhaustive, is one of the greatest things that is happening right now as we speak is that over in the College Avenue building, or over there are many wonderful people who are serving the children and the youth. They are leading them to life in Christ. They're answering their questions. They are going through Bible studies. They're making a safe space. They are providing godly mentorship. They are living out what the 12 stones are supposed to represent. And you can do that too. And so the point here is that you're supposed to remember God's works, that there is an aspect and responsibility in your life to carry forward the things that God has done and to tell other people about it. I know there are some of you who have truly, just by God's grace, picked up a Bible and nobody ever told you about it and started reading and understood the Lord. But for the vast majority of you, the reason that you are here is because somebody introduced you to the faith, somebody brought you to this place, somebody did something to pass on what they already knew so that you could be here as well. And so now it's our responsibility to do that. So in crossing the Jordan River, we see this clear picture of God leading Israel once again through the unknown. where they need to go. And Israel was asked to literally step out in faith, uncertain of how God would act, but certain that he would. And our lives are often filled with moments of uncertainty, and the question is not whether God will move, but whether we have the trust to take that step of faith before he does. And then once he does, whether we will be obedient to continue to tell the next group of people about his power and his might and why he is worthy of fear and respect. Because what history has shown is that if we fail to do that, good things do not often follow, right? It's an amazing testament of Israel crossing the Jordan River. It's huge for them. And like I've said, as we go forth in Joshua, the book is going to change now. They're in the promised land. Stuff is different. But in our own lives, the question is not so much if God is going to be there. The question is if we are expecting great things to happen and if we will tell people about them after he has done it. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come before you today, and Lord, we expect great things to happen. Lord, we expect that you will do mighty works in our life. And God, we don't necessarily mean that there's health, wealth, and happiness for every single answered prayer. God, often you work in ways that we don't fully understand, but yet we know that you have not left us. You are a living God who is among us, who is walking before us through the uncertain steps ahead. Lord, you are the one who guides us every step of the way, and we are thankful for that. Lord, I pray that we would expect great things in our own life, that your Spirit would increase our faith so that we could do this, Lord, and that when you do it, inevitably, God, that we would have the obedience and the faith to just place some stones of our own. Lord, wherever it is, to have a reminder, a memorial of your good and beautiful purposes. God, we thank you for all of these things, and it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Welcome back to the studio. Once again, we have Connor.
Hey,
We do not have Jason.
don't.
He's
Jason's
under the weather.
sick.
He is under the weather. Stay away. Stay away from him. Give him some space
Just for right now.
so he can, maybe tomorrow.
Yeah, wherever. But yeah, Jason's not with us. So it's just Teresa and I. And you know what? I think that we might be the worse off because Jason isn't here.
He really anchors us.
He does. But
He keeps us from going down the, I can't even say it with a straight face.
but we might be able to be a little bit more locked into a flow of the podcast. We'll see. We'll see what happens.
I make no promises. Speaking of which, let me ask you my first question because it's really ridiculous. My mind wanders during sermons. I love it when it wanders around what you're talking about. Because I have such, I guess, this visual way of processing information. I'm imagining the 100-foot wall of water.
Sure.
And I'm imagining the priests carrying the ark. They can't even touch it. They got to use the wood rails to carry it because they can't touch it. And why did all of them have to get clear out into the riverbed before the waters? Like, I want to know, like, is there some symbolism I'm missing? Is there some deeper meaning why they all had to be out into the riverbed before the waters would be held back?
I think it's the lead priest's feet hit the water and then it begins to sort of get dammed up. But the question is a great one in the sense that and it wasn't really able to emphasize this enough during the message, but the role of the Ark of the Covenant is, if it were its own person, like it would be the main character here, really. In chapters 3 and 4, the Ark being a sign of the covenant, it's mentioned 10 different times that it's not just the Ark, right? It is the Ark of the Covenant. And sometimes the title is even longer. It's the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of the earth, of all of these different things, right? And so it's really, there's two parts to it. To get to your question about the priest's feet, I do think there's an aspect where sort of this physical element of stepping out in faith that the priests were required to do to represent. But what is also clear is that it's the location of the ark that sort of determines, and therefore representing the physical presence of God, is what determines the status of the river. So for instance, the priests just put their toes into the water, then the waters stop up. The priests get to the middle of the river. They hang out there while the whole nation of Israel passes. And then it's not until the ark gets over to the other side, and it says basically as soon as they step out of the riverbed, the river goes back to its normal process. And it's just, what is the Ark of the Covenant doing? The priests are sort of like they're there for the ride, you know? I mean, the ark serves to, it leads the procession. I already mentioned, like, it's when the ark touches the water, or is representing touching the water, that it parts. The whole thing about the memorial stones, where they get them from, like the feet under the priests. It's really not where the priests are standing. It's where the ark is present.
The priest standing there did not make it, if you want to call it, holy ground. It was the presence of the ark.
Yep.
And if we know that God is powerful enough that if he had wanted to levitate that ark across, he could have manifested that in any way he wanted to, because he's God. But he chose to use those 12 men to do that job.
Well, so the 12 men are sort of separate from the priests. We don't know how many. There's a specific arrangement of the priests we find out back in Numbers who are going to be carrying the ark. It's a certain tribe within Levi that has that responsibility. But yeah, God could have done anything with it, but he's sort of working within the means that he had set forth previously. The ark has this very you could say rules of engagement. There are these very specific rules. It's why Israel's not supposed to get too close. Because if you touch it and you're not supposed to, you'll die. Happens later in the Bible. 1,000 feet's a long way.
That's a long way.
Long way. But imagine also, you're in the nation of Israel. You're walking towards the Jordan. It's flooded. You know, you can see probably off in the hill distance where they cross is only like 5 miles away from Jericho. I mean, they're immediately in the territory that they're going to we'll be in this next week talking about it. And just what's going through your head. And then you see you're 1,000 feet behind or more, and you probably can't even witness the priest's feet hitting the water. But all of a sudden you start seeing the water get backed up, and you start seeing this wall form. I mean, it would be quite the sight.
If you're towards the back of the line and you're seeing this build up before you're even there, that would really be something to take in. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So I think it all comes down to, in short, what is the ark doing? What is the role? And how does that ark, why are they mentioning so many times that it's the Ark of the Covenant? Because it represents the promises of God.
The covenant.
It's a physical reminder of this spiritual commitment that God has made to Israel, and Israel has supposed to be making to the Lord. We'll come to see even this next week with circumcision that they maybe haven't been keeping up with their end of the deal. But regardless, the ark represents God's faithfulness to them. And so that's why it ends up being this thing. It's not just like throughout history, somebody maybe carries a banner, or, you've got a drum or
standard.
Yeah, exactly. Like, that's not it. It's not just a message of who they are. Like, the ark really does denote God's physical presence, even though he doesn't live there. So
it is complicated. It's not just a symbol. As you said, it is a character.
Yes. In its own way in the story, and the power that it has. And so that's also why, and I didn't mention this in the message, but so the 12 men, they go and they gather the stones for the memorial, and they place it on the dry side, on the western side of the Jordan in Gilgal. But there's a second memorial, actually, that Joshua makes, where he goes to the same place where they gathered the stones, where the priests were standing, where the ark is. But he actually places another memorial in the middle of the river there. And
so this is while they're still there.
Yeah, while
the water is held back.
While the water's held back, Joshua himself makes another memorial there in the middle of the Jordan River. And some people, have asked the question, like, well, what is the purpose there? It could be very well that when the Jordan hits the dry season, and the waters recede, that you would be able to see the very top of the memorial stones.
As a reminder.
There. Yeah, as a reminder of where they crossed.
If it's dry season, and I'm stepping way out here, but as a Kansas, not farm girl, but I live in a farm state. If it's dry and the waters go down, you could use a reminder that God's going to bring rain again.
Yeah.
Maybe that's overstepping it, but
well, I think it's all part of it. I mean, there's the Bible. The Old Testament is suffused with these different locations and places where just going there was supposed to remind them of something that God was doing.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Great. I really appreciated the application of the different things that we can and should be doing to kind of pass on our legacy of faith to our families and to friends. And it reminded me of a story we've heard here of a TBC family. This is a real family who attends our church, and some of you know them, the Brocious family. Mm-hmm. And Jerry and Barb have been long time involved in Topeka Bible Church, and they have adult children and they have several grandchildren. And Barb shared with me, they have more than
several grandchildren.
Yes.
Yeah, they've got a bunch. Yeah.
Shared with me a couple of months ago that they were really intentional about this idea. I didn't know that's what this was, but what they shared with me was that they gathered their family on, I assume, like a Sunday afternoon after church for a meal, and then an intentional sharing from Jerry and Barb of ways that they have seen God at work. They have had several different kind of ministry connections, men's and women's groups and small groups, and co-ed, and just the whole being involved with students and kids, and just all the ways they have seen God at work through them over the years. Because I imagine for some of those younger grandkids who just know them as grandma and grandpa, that they may not imagine them as young people who are involved in a student ministry. And just to be able to share that legacy with them and the importance, not just look at what I did. In fact, it's not about look at what I did. It's look at what God used me to do. Yeah.
I think it's neat. I funny enough, I caught them at the end of the second service, saw them after church, and said, I almost had you on a slide. Not everybody feels the same way about, sort of having their face be 10 foot tall up there. Yeah. But yeah, Jerry and Barb, I was able to tell them, I really thought what they did with their grandkids was the perfect example of this idea of passing it on to the next generation, and I think that, there are so many ways to do it, right? But sitting their kids down, not just giving a testimony, but saying, look, this is what our faith means to us. This is how the Lord has worked in our life. This is what he has done. I mean, that was sort of the impetus behind the memorial stones. Is the question is, Dad, what do these stones mean? Mm-hmm. And they're like, let me be able to tell you what God has done before and what he will continue to do in your life. And it's truly the greatest gift that you can give anybody is their faith, to help lead them to that understanding. I'm sure many of their kids and grandkids would say the same thing, that will be the legacy that they have amongst many wonderful things is what they have done for their family and leading them to faith in Christ. I have no doubt in my mind the Lord smiles and is happy to see those things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we have one kind of little connection to next week, which is that when Israel crosses the Jordan River, it's Passover time. Now, Passover is sort of a period. It's not like one day. It's not like Christmas Eve, Christmas Day sort of thing, but it's a period of time of preparation anyhow. But Israel crosses during Passover, and then they will celebrate Passover, which we'll see next week when they're about to take on Jericho. But I just wanted to point it out because crossing the Jordan River sort of serves as this bookend and this parallel with crossing the Red Sea. Right.
Going back to that, which was also during that Passover time.
Oh, yeah. Yes, exactly. So, they, with the Passover time here, it just sort of doubles down on this concept. So they celebrate. Passover originated. I mean, the whole idea of Passover was originally during the 10th plague and the death of the firstborn, those who had the blood of the lamb on their doorpost, the angel passed over their house. So anyone who had faith that the Lord was going to do these things, they were spared. And then all of these other elements of Passover, like eating unleavened bread, which exemplified their need to hurry and to leave quickly, they were all instituted during that time. Mm-hmm. And though Israel did celebrate Passover during the wandering years, the Passover that they celebrate here not only, again, forms that bookend with crossing about body of water and having this ceremony, but it's the first Passover that they've had, since Egypt, where they're not eating manna, mm-hmm. where they're able to have the grain of the new land. And in fact, it's after the day after the Passover meal, where they were able to have the grain of the new land, the manna stops. They're no longer eating it. They're relying on the produce of the promised land to feed them. It's been handed over. Yeah.
So remind me, the kind of the customs that are part of Passover, they are outlined
back in Exodus.
Mm-hmm. And so this is the first time they've really been able to fully practice all of that in the way that would become part of their heritage for centuries.
It seems that we know that they practiced Passover mm-hmm. because it mentions it multiple times during the wandering years. But yes, this is the first time where it's referenced in the Bible as like they did it like it was meant to be done, if you will. They were able to fully partake in all of the things that were needed. And so, they had livestock during the wandering years, and so they would have been able to have the meat and those kinds of things. But this symbolic idea of using the grain from the promised land to make this unleavened bread, to just really, it's a full circle moment. Like the Exodus, mm-hmm. in fact, it's one of the things we'll get to next week. This is going to sound random, but it is connected. The circumcision of the current generation, God says it's finally removed the reproach of Egypt from you. And what he means by that is that, we don't think about this, but Egypt, right? They were defeated. The Israelites were emancipated from slavery and ran off. But then they sort of talked this big game about this God that they were following. And then they wander in the desert for 40 years, seeming to not really be going mm-hmm. to this promised land they'd been talking about. And what we find out is that Egypt had like scorn and was making fun of them. Like they were saying, who is this God that you've left us to go ahead and follow? And there are just all of these full circle moments that hit one on top of the other during this point in time, where one of them is Passover, another one is circumcision, where God says, like, you've arrived. Like, this is where we were going all along. You finally made it. We should have been here 40 mm-hmm. years earlier, but like the scorn of Egypt is now off of your shoulders. They can no longer look at you and say, where is your God?
And remind us, you've told us numerous times, how far was point A and point B? How far apart?
Yeah, there's a bit of debate because the way they were originally going to enter the promised land, like when Caleb and Joshua were the spies, they were going into the promised land from, what would it be, like the southwest edge of the promised land. They were going in from a northeast direction. Mm-hmm. Which is not how they're entering right now, right. Which is directly from the east side. But regardless, it was, like a week, okay. If as the crow flies. It's not like they were going to be wandering for months and months and months. This is something that they were.
It's like they have wandered around the entire world. Not geographically, but like time-wise, as if they had somehow made a foot trip around the entire world just to get back to where they could have been in a week.
Yes.
But God had a purpose.
He did.
A plan.
Yeah, he did. So anyhow, there's a little bit of connection. When we get to that next week, we won't spend too much time on all those details, but people who are listening to the podcast will know sort of the connection of the Passover and the crossing of the Jordan. Those were related to each other.
Okay. Very good. Yeah. Connor, thank you very much.
Sure.
And our thanks to Spencer, who was here earlier. Spencer Kovach, am I saying the right name correctly? I don't think we said his full name while he was on camera. So if you waited around that long, there you go. There's your little Easter egg. Thank you for tuning in. We will see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the TBC Extra Podcast. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.